Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, I ask our guests just one question, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I'm your brand new host, Dominique, taking up the mantle from my friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Melissa Horn. Like Melissa, I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator and advocate working for the DEI and e-learning consultancy called Dialectic in lovely Guelph, Ontario. If you want to know a little bit more about me, you can check out our last episode. So on this week's episode, I'm joined by Sydney Butler. Sydney is an HR professional, a speaker, a DEIB facilitator, an accessibility and neurodiversity consultant, and they're also the founder of Accessible Creates. Sydney's professional purpose is to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to be successful, regardless of the barriers in their way, and their professional goal is to remove these barriers. They conduct training and consulting to help companies be more accessible and inclusive from a human approach, and to help them recruit and retain more diverse individuals through the lens of human resources in DEI. Sydney is also a founding member of In Her Sight, or IHS, which is a diverse community of professionals from across Canada, filling the gap in existing services for recent women immigrants. Hi, Sydney. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So the question that we're going to explore together today is, how can we create more accessible workplaces through our language? And I know from my own work that the task of creating accessible workplaces from a neurodiversity and disabilities perspective is really complex. It's so complex that a lot of workplaces feel a kind of overwhelm when they decide to take it on. So I often hear questions like, where do we even start? Or is it possible to have a perfectly inclusive process given the wide range of individual needs? So I really see the value today in focusing on something specific and positive that people and companies can do to get started, like addressing some of the language that we use. So I think it's really great that we're zoning in on that and that you recommended that as a question. So before we dive into the question, Sydney, I want to invite you to speak a little bit about yourself. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about your story and how you came to focus on workplace accessibility professionally.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I always wanted to change the world, and I knew the world was always accommodating of me. I worked to my tippy toes. I had a speech impediment. I couldn't say my R's. I spoke too fast. And, I would get accommodation. I would go to speech therapy sometimes, and then I'd be like, okay. And other times I wouldn't get accommodation for other things I needed. And I was like, I would excel and do well when I, had that accommodation. And when I didn't have that accommodation, I was like, I'm really struggling. But then I felt like I wasn't allowed to struggle because I was getting that support in other areas.
Yeah.
And so, I went through school. And then when I was in high school, I studied business. I took a business course. Previously, before that, I was going to be an environmentalist, because again, I wanted to change the world.
Hey, me too.
To focus on climate change.
Yeah.
But then I was like, I studied business. Then I went to Sheridan College for human resources for both my advanced diploma and my degree. And then during that time, I was like, I'm really passionate about accessibility and, supporting neurodiversity in the workplace. I mean, that would be my unique factor when I go into studying HR and doing HR. And so I also at the time, I was also working in a recreational setting, helping other kids, teens, and adults with disabilities. And I also had some, of my colleagues that also had disabilities, but there was such a shift between how the supervisors and the co-workers interacting with the employees that had disabilities versus the participants that had disabilities. And also, I had a leg condition that was getting worse at the time. I was dealing with a lot, I also was diagnosed with PTSD. And so it was just a lot and more neurodivergence and more disability. And so I was like, okay, I need to really focus on this area. And then
Absolutely.
I graduated. I worked in HR for a little bit. I worked at an HR startup, worked at HR as at an employment agency called Skills for Change. And for them, I did a lot of work on accessibility, like AODA policies and procedures. I did workshops with them on how to support disabilities in the workplace. And then I realized that, a lot of companies are now focusing on D&I initiatives, but still more focusing on disabilities and focusing on neurodiversity in the workplace. and then I actually spoke at an event. They even come speak about supporting neurodiversity. So I did, and I loved it. And so I was like, hey, maybe I can start my own company to provide training and consulting, take my HR background and what my passion area is. And, because a lot of companies, like I said, want to focus on this area of diversity, equity, inclusion. So I was like, I need to do that. So that's kind of my story.
That's amazing. It's so nice to see your face lit up when you're talking about speaking about this issue.
Thank you.
It's so clear that it's your passion, and I think you have a really powerful story and a really powerful voice in this area. So it's a pleasure to speak with you on this today. Though to really embrace inclusive practices in all aspects of a workplace, I guess the first step is people need to understand why it's important. You mentioned in your previous answer, just in your story, that it almost feels sometimes like disability and neurodiversity are sort of like these last bastions of inclusion. So people are sort of afraid to get started, or they're maybe not super focused on that, and they're focused on other areas of inclusion like race and gender. Can you share a little bit about sort of the hidden impacts of not doing inclusion well in this area for neurodiversity and disability?
Yeah, so a lot, like you said, and it's so interesting because disability and neurodiversity can go across all other areas of inclusivity and diversity. Because, white people, Black people, brown, anyone, LGBT people, all these different things, disability and neurodiversity can impact them as well. And so, we just really understanding that people, it's like, I think there's still that stigma, when people think, oh, disability, they think disability is a bad word from the start. They think neurodiversity, they don't really know what it means, in this, but it's like, it's so interesting because it impacts everyone. Someone knows someone that has a disability or that experiences neurodiversity, but a lot of times, in the workplace, a lot of people are like, oh, the entry level positions only, or that, that they get government money. I think that's a huge issue. A lot of people they get money from the government, so they don't need to work. Is a huge bias and barrier. And it's like, first of all, that's not a livable wage. And people with disabilities deserve and should be able to do any career and work if they want to work, if it's possible for them to work. And a lot of times too, people that are neurodivergent or have disabilities are actually more likely to go to post-secondary. A lot of people don't know that, because they're interested and want to pursue their passions and, go into a career with that, they focus on that interest. And so a lot of times they don't get the jobs though because of the interview process. There's a lot of barriers to it.
Yeah.
And so, but it's like they have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have the drive. It's just because the interview process, there's so many barriers. And the hiring process is just so it's confusing for anyone. Like if you ask anyone, they literally feel like they're putting on a facade when they do interviews, even if they're non-disabled and neurotypical. And so imagine, being disabled, having a disability and being neurodivergent.
Absolutely.
It's very difficult.
So I really like this idea. What I'm hearing you say in that first part is that workplace accessibility and the successful inclusion of neurodiverse and disabled people can in some ways be sort of a way for people in that workplace to have more exposure, to better understand and to work alongside people who are different from them if they are themselves neurotypical. It can help them sort of be in a position to challenge those assumptions that they have made just for lack of exposure or for lack of experience. So that's a really powerful thing. And then the other thing I'm hearing you say, and thank you so much for bringing this up, is that neurodiverse people and disabled people are often highly skilled. And so excluding them, you're just missing out on all of these skilled workers. I recently read that it's almost 20% of people are neurodivergent in some way. And so we're talking about kind of a large swath of the population here. We're talking about people who have, dyslexia, ADHD, autism, all kinds of learning disabilities and differences. And it's quite a lot of people. And if it's not you, I'm sure you know someone, right? So one thing, and we chatted about this a little bit before, but I want to kind of bring this to the forefront for a moment. While I think it's really powerful to imagine, the benefits of an inclusive workplace from a business perspective, like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we include a person who has autism to get their different perspective, or maybe we'll be more innovative if we have a range of neurodiverse people on our team. Part of me really aches when I read articles that frame neurodivergence as sort of like a superpower, or somehow equate it with, data and tech expertise. And there's a pattern in articles, especially online articles, where that's really what is being said. It's really a focus primarily on the business case for inclusion. So I'm just wondering how you feel about that, and whether when you're talking to clients, people are receptive to talking about inclusion of neurodiversity and disability just because it's the right thing to do. What's the response that you're getting from workplaces?
It's very interesting because, like you said, there's so many articles. I've, a lot of people are like, oh, I like your articles. I also write articles because I take more that, it's the right thing to do approach. Yeah, it's important to talk about the business case, and, as a business person and, working in business and working in HR and helping business operations. But, a lot of times it's other industries too. It's like they just do it, doesn't have to be that business case. And in other areas of diversity, it doesn't have to be that business case constantly. But I think there's also, and it's also always the same points. We just talk about that for a second. It's always like increases innovation, increases, and I do that too because that's what businesses want to hear.
Yeah.
But it's also like there's so much more benefits than just that and the human side of things. And I really try to look at the thing, I always say hire, like I talk about the benefits like that, but then I'm also like hire the person and consider the person for the unique experiences, skills, and abilities they bring to a team. Because we all have unique experiences, we all have different skills we have, and those should be considered, when you're looking at hiring neurodivergent talent or disabled talent, because we all have different life experiences that shape who we are, the resilience, things we've had to overcome, the skills we've learned even post-secondary, just day to day is in our day-to-day lives, we're all vast human beings, and also understanding that sometimes, people with disabilities and the neurodivergent unfortunately don't have that career experience yet because no one's given them that shot. And so, but they have volunteer experience. Like I remember when I worked in a recreational setting, a lot of the adults I was working with, like, hey, can you help me with my resume? I volunteer. Oh, you show me any good place to volunteer, and get those skills that they can apply to the workplace. And really looking at, okay, they have these skills because they did this, and they're passionate about this. Oh, for example, Jessica likes to volunteer with cats, so she wants to go work at a vet place. All these different things, and just being really mindful that it's the right thing to do, and people, if they want to work, they deserve to work. And, just giving someone a shot.
Absolutely. And that's a really powerful message, right? Everyone deserves to work, and it should just be sort of the status quo that workplaces reflect the communities that they're operating in, and including the people that make up the fabric of society. So it's really interesting just to think about other ways that companies can gain by doing that type of inclusion. And that it's not an optional lift. It's not a lift that comes after, those big other ones like gender and race and stuff. It should really be sort of at the forefront. So something that keeps people from getting started is definitely that it's a little intimidating, I think. This is a message that I hear a lot. So maybe what we can do next is just talk about a few key things that people can do to create belonging for neurodiverse and disabled people in the workplace. What are some very practical things? And we talked about, maybe through the lens of language, some practical things that workplaces can be doing to sort of get started on inclusion.
Yeah, I think, just being willing to be educated and to learn is the first. Education is key. I'm going to say that forever, because education, if you don't know something, you don't know. So starting the education journey, and then also being mindful of how you're going about, a lot of times too, companies post on job boards, but they don't change the language and talk about the language piece. And so they're like, oh, we can just post on any job board and get the candidates we want.
Right.
But, if you post, the way your job description was with the industry language and the company jargon, it's like, what does it mean? It all means something to you and your company and your industry. But, it could be very confusing. So, looking at your language, it's like, okay, for example, not of companies and jargon, but another issue is like, lifting, oh, must lift 15 pounds, must lift this, blah, 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 and that's like, that's like, okay, I can't do that, or I can't do
Right.
that every day. And that automatically exterminates someone from, applying for that job.
Right.
It's really looking at what is actually mandatory for the job,
Yeah.
what is actually necessary. I find that a lot of times after working in HR and working alongside HR people as my clients in this area, a lot of times like, oh, in their head, they have an ideal candidate that they want.
Yeah.
They don't mean to discriminate against, but it's like they have this ideal candidate that's like superhuman, basically,
Mm-hmm.
or can do all these things, but it's not actually necessary for the job. But they put that on the job description, hoping to get that candidate.
Right. Yeah, I've seen a lot of that where it's a little bit like a wish list,
Yes.
and only about half of it really describes the
Mm.
position. And I think a message, even just as a woman, I get
Mm-hmm.
a lot of messaging from people around me saying, "Oh, but just go ahead and apply." And I think, well, it's intimidating. I don't have these skills, and it seems like they're looking for something else that's
Mm-hmm.
not me. And
Exactly.
who doesn't have that problem
Mm-hmm.
is typically neurotypical able-bodied white cis men who
Mm-hmm.
seem to be able to just apply for anything, and that's sort of
I don't know how
the
they do
message.
it.
Yeah, the message that I've been getting. But you really, if you don't walk into a room and feel like um, that opportunity belongs to you, it's a really difficult thing to overcome, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
feel like, yeah, absolutely, opportunities to be more specific with the types of skills that are needed, not add things to a job description that are perhaps just nice to haves,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even things like stating on, I've seen this a few times where people are starting to state at the bottom of a posting, if you don't have these or all of them, we still want to hear from you, right? Just opening the door a
I
little
think
bit.
that I think that's starting to help, but it's also like with this still that mentality, that's
Mm,
just it's like okay, but it's like it's still like I don't know, because it's internal at that point,
yeah.
and really understanding. So it's like and when you put it at the bottom, you're kind of making up for the fact that it's like kind of
Right.
intuitive. You
Yeah.
know what I
Like you
mean?
haven't done a great job throughout. And then it's
Yeah.
the
The
little,
last add-on,
the last
kind of like the
add-on.
accommodation statement, going into
Right.
that, the accommodation statement. I always, suggest to my clients and to people that it should be at the top, because when you put it at the bottom, it seems like an afterthought that it's like, oh, do you really want to accommodate me? And it's like
Right.
usually like one sentence, and it's like, oh yeah, if you need, it's very vague. And so a lot of people still feel like, oh, I don't know, even with the accommodation statement there, at the bottom sometimes, and it's just so super short. It's like, will they really accommodate me? Did they just do that to cover their butts
Hmm.
kind of thing? And again, it's all going back to that perception and, how it's seen as an afterthought.
Yeah. Yeah. And aside from job descriptions, so this is really great, but
Mhm.
like moving past a job description,
Yeah.
are there key things that people can do in other areas, like in a job interview, for example?
There's little, yeah, so like, having closed captions if it's a remote interview, having ASL interpreters available, being able to just modify the question. A lot of time, people are like, oh, the question has to be that certain way because that's the way it was written. That's what, we're gonna get the most. It's like, but if you can't modify the question, how good of an interviewer and recruiter are you? Because you should be able to modify the question to best so the person can best understand. You
Hmm.
know, I always suggest, also having questions ahead of time. We all have busy lives, and our lives aren't just work. Allow for more processing time, both like by providing the questions ahead of time, the person can go over it like, oh, well, we want to know if they can think on their feet. It's like you can ask one question, if you must, to see if they can think on their feet, but, mostly have the questions ahead of time. And when you provide the questions ahead of time, you allow the personality to shine through more. They get more better answers. You see if they're actually a better fit for the company because they've had time to think about it. When it just rush, 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 we all get, with stress, pressure, processing time. Sometimes, your mind goes blank. I remember I was doing an
Right.
interview and I was like, I know the basic questions, but I was still like, one question was like, it just blanked, and so I think having the questions ahead of time will help eliminate that bias.
Absolutely. No, these are great tips and great ideas. And then I'm just conscious of the fact that, if somebody does get hired,
Mm-hmm.
and they've had accommodations through the interview process, and then they enter the workplace. I can imagine situations in which the workplace is not very well equipped to keep them there. So,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of making them actually feel like they belong, is there anything that we can do that's sort of, what's the low-hanging fruit here? What can workplaces do to get started in terms
Mm-hmm.
of actually accommodating people who do make it through the interview
Mm-hmm.
process and who are integrated into the workplace?
It all starts with a conversation, having a
Mm,
conversation with the individual, and coming up with that game plan. With accommodations, a lot of people in organizations think, oh, medical accommodation, and
right.
it has to be expensive, but that's not the case. Just have that initial check-in, be like, and then go from there. It's like, how often do and continue the check-in process, being like, okay, how often do you want to check, do you need to check in daily, to see that, weekly, monthly, like how often you want me to check in on you and your progress, and also be mindful that you can change how frequently you check in. If they think, oh, I'm sure okay, I've worked in a similar job before, or like this is the first time, they might need more check-in, they may need less check-in. And so really having that conversation with the individual and getting to understand their needs and what their
Mm-hmm.
requirements are to best be successful in their work and in their day-to-day tasks.
Mm-hmm. That's a great piece of advice. Another thing that I've come across in my own learning is also
Mm-hmm.
the importance of making job requirements very clear. And this is
Mm-hmm.
something I feel like most of these accommodations, they benefit everyone. This is
Mm-hmm.
something that it's like it just is good design and good practice. And it's setting sort of the stage for inclusion, but it's also just things that can benefit everybody across the board. So something like making sure that job requirements are clear, and that if we're going to be measuring sort of
Mm-hmm.
performance on any sort of metric, that is also communicated so that there's no surprise later about, you know, am I doing a good job? How do I know? Like
Mm-hmm.
just eliminating that anxiety and that
And
worry.
I think talking about that communication, it's like, okay, how does a person need to be? You just talked about the communicating of the job tasks and the job
Yeah.
requirements. It's like, okay, can the person understand verbally if you tell them, that verbal instruction? Does it have to be via Slack if your company uses Slack, or via
Mm-hmm.
email and written instructions? And then really understanding, okay, oh, why didn't you do such and such task? After they told it verbally, I forgot what you said. Like, and it's like, can you write it down for me? Can you remind me? Just little simple little things.
Yeah.
And in communicating, like you said about performance, communicating, it's like, hey, having that check-in goes in
Yes.
with the performance, having
Yeah.
them included in the performance plan, being like, oh, okay, a lot of times managers are like, they work on their own, working about the performance plan, but really working with the employee for the feedback. It's like, okay, what do you think you could have done well? What do you think you did well? What do you think you could improve upon?
Yeah.
Having them actively included in that process, not just being like, this is what I think you can improve upon. This is what you did well. It's like it doesn't allow for them to have that self-reflection piece and see if it does coincide. If there's areas they think they can improve upon that's different from what you think, and just
Right.
having everyone be included in that process.
That's great. Are there any things that colleagues can do,
Mm-hmm.
especially neurotypical colleagues or colleagues who don't have a
Mm-hmm.
disability? Are there things that they could demand or sort of try to set the stage for in their workplace so
Mm-hmm.
that if there is a person who needs an accommodation, it's not the burden is not entirely on that person to sort of shift the whole
Mm-hmm.
system.
I think, just being mindful, listening, if they do, and mostly, I mean, when someone that has a disability or that is neurodivergent asks for help them. But
Mm-hmm.
also when they, when a lot of people want to help, but it's like, if they don't ask for help, don't help them. It's like they think they can do it themselves. They want to do it by themselves. Like, oh, I can do that for you. You think you can get it done in less time. It's like let the person do what they need to do, and then it's like if they do need help, they'll ask you, or
Yeah.
ask them if they need help before, sometimes it is an issue. People just want to help and they just do it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
ask them, do you need help? I would, you look like, and the person's like, no, I'm good. Take them what they say, even though if it might seem to you like they're struggling, they're doing it differently than how you would do it. Take them at face value. Be like, okay, they don't want help right now. But then when you ask them if they need help, they're like, oh, the person actually wants to help. So when they do need help next time, oh, Timmy's gonna help me because he asked me last
Yeah.
time,
Yeah. So just building that relationship
Exactly. It's
and
all about building relationships, having that conversation,
right.
and just breaking down the attitude toward people with disabilities and that are
Yes.
neurodivergent in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that comes to mind for me certainly is, when we work in these fast-paced environments
Mm-hmm.
where things are high stress,
Mm-hmm.
possibly, or there's a lot of strain, even for somebody who isn't, doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
neurodiversity or a disability. I wonder if there's ways to kind of adopt a lens of, okay, if somebody did have
Mm-hmm.
a struggle with this particular task, how could they modify it, or how would they
Mm-hmm.
report this, or does our workplace have the structures to even have this conversation or report this or modify the workflow?
Mm-hmm.
How does our team work, and is there room for that? Is there room for accommodation?
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear and explicit? Um, these are things that certainly I think about,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering if you think that that's helpful, just sort of like setting the stage
Mm-hmm.
for people who, and trying to do some of that work so that
Yeah.
when the person comes in, they don't have to do it all. They don't have to do all the heavy
Mm-hmm.
lifting and all of the asks.
Yeah, I think it's also important to realize that it's like, it's a collective effort. We're all also being mindful that, to educate yourself more and to really understand that it's like, okay, I want to help, I want to be an ally. So again, that starts with education, but also being like, okay, do you need anything? And just really being like, also being mindful that people don't have to disclose. A lot of people right
Yeah.
now don't know that they're neurodivergent, but they're experiencing struggles in the workplace. We know that people are now being more diagnosed with ADHD and autism because they're like, they think things are, but then they don't, they don't know sometimes that they have these things, but you see like, oh, I'm struggling with this, but I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what it is. I just know I'm struggling with that task, because
Yep.
we're all human. And so just be like, hey, here with my task, or it's like, having flexible schedules. Actually, I just spoke at a company and I was actually quite impressed with them. I was like, I talk about supporting neurodiversity in the workplace, and they're like how one, for example, works in a courtroom. And so the person, they're like, hey, my anxiety levels are really high today. And then they switched out. She did admin behind the scenes and someone else
Mm,
did the worked in the courtroom the day. And I was like, that's beautiful. Like, I just thought that
yeah.
was
Yeah.
amazing because it's just something as simple as that.
Yeah.
You don't have to be disclosed this, hey, this is because of why, but just I'm not feeling the best. Can we switch? Can we move around? Even when you work, when you work in projects, being mindful, hey, I want this part of the project, this is what I'm most passionate about, this is what area of the project I'm interested in. Can I do this part? And but supporting each other that way as well.
I really like that idea of not relying on disclosure. That's a great
Mm-hmm.
reminder to our listeners too, that, setting it up so that disclosure isn't necessary to get
Mm-hmm.
accommodation, that it should just be, I guess, taken away from this sort of medical model of disability,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding that, you know, not everybody has that diagnosis. Not everybody
Mm-hmm.
necessarily even knows, but that doesn't
It's
make the
very expensive to get a
right.
diagnosis.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I can disclose at this time too. Like my son is autistic,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been navigating autism services as myself, and I find it to be extraordinarily challenging and
Mm-hmm.
very expensive. And I've had the thought so many times along the way, what if I didn't have this level of privilege? I would not be
Mm-hmm.
able to navigate this. My son would not be getting the services that he now has. He would not, have an IEP in schools. He would just not
Mm-hmm.
be as taken care of, because it
Mm-hmm.
comes straight out of my pocket, is how it goes at the end of the day. So
Mm-hmm.
it's absolutely a reality that a lot of people need accommodations, won't have a diagnosis, and that should be okay. It should be okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
For people to just ask, and for us to interact as human beings together in a team,
Exactly.
right? I really appreciate that you brought that up, and I think it's a really valuable insight and a thing for our listeners to take home. So as we sort of round the bend here, I'd like to encourage our listeners to really take that next step in creating a truly accessible workplace. So if you're curious about Sydney and their work at Accessible Creates, you can find a link to their website and socials in the show notes. So Sydney Butler, thank you so much for joining us today. And as always, I welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast, or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone. You can find my email in the show notes. So thanks again, Sydney. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. I'm Dominique. Thank you for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.